What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Week 13 NFL Main Slate Review Show. As always, myself here and joined by Max Steinberg. Max, nice to have you back, my man. And if you guys missed it, SaberSim had a very, very exciting weekend with Shady Advice winning the small field Millie Maker, the 2.5 Mega Millionaire. So we are definitely going to hit on that. So congratulations to Shady Advice if you guys are in our Discord. You know, he is in there each and every day helping people get better, answering their questions, and providing just that knowledge that he brings to DFS. So really excited for him to win his first Millie Maker. Max, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited for Shady Advice for winning. He is not only a SaberSim user, it's very clear that SaberSim's a big part of his process, because if you look at his lineups every week, they are some of the highest rated in sim ROI. So my guess is this top lineup, which I have not looked at, is probably going to be like that. So that's really exciting too. So it was a fun week and something that'll be fun to analyze.
Absolutely. So I'm going to get SaberSim pulled up here. We are going to start with the small field Millie and Max. Man, where would you like to start?
Well, let's just look at this lineup from Shady Advice. And I don't know, maybe let's just look at his lineups in general and see kind of what direction he went. Because obviously he won, and that is pretty exciting. And he also didn't max out this contest. He probably
that is what I wanted to see here.
I wonder if he soloed it. My guess is no, because he's a pretty big baller. But no, he actually just had straight up one entry.
Wow, so I did not know that.
I think what's interesting here is he sort of went chalk in a couple of different ways, right? He's Brock Purdy, who, would you mind checking this out and seeing? I think he's probably the highest quarterback in this contest. Yes, by far. And he went with Zach Moss, who ended up getting 85% ownership. And so he really didn't go any particular way in terms of trying to get contrarian in that way. He does have a contrarian bring back with Devonta Smith. Trey McBride ended up actually being kind of lower owned, I think, with that questionable tag and his disappointing weeks and a worse matchup. People just sort of got off him. He also went double tight end. I know I've gotten to arguments with Shady Advice in the past about if double tight end is good. And I think he's proved me very wrong multiple times. And it just seems like a lot of times it just depends on value, right? Brevin Jordan was a really good value and Trey McBride's a good value. And so it's just depending on the week and depending on the upside of those tight ends, it can make sense to go double tight end, especially in a smaller contest like this. But yeah, I mean, it seems like he just kind of made a lineup that projected well, peppered in some contrarian plays that were some of the higher salary, like Devonta Smith and Kyron Williams and Trey McBride, and then went basically chalk the rest of the way. And it ended up working out very well for him. Do you have any thoughts about this lineup?
My only thought is not so much on the analysis side, more kind of like on the sweat equity side. If you look at like his players and like the timing here, like Zach Moss, 7 points, kind of a dud. Brevin Jordan, 9 points, like not great showing there. Trey McBride, that game was delayed into the afternoon. And then he had the Falcons D, which did pretty good. So like after the morning window, you're looking at Zach Moss, Brevin Jordan, locked Trey McBride in the Falcons. Like, I would be curious to know if he late swapped here.
He might have, right? It's possible he had like AJ Brown and someone else and like Rashad White, maybe. I don't know if those two would have fit, and he pivoted to these two, which would, I mean, wow, I'd be curious to ask him, because that would have been a very smart move. Because you're right, with the pieces he had in the early slate, it might have been really hard to win. So that's very interesting.
And I don't know the answer to that question. We'll have to get him on a show and ask him some questions about his win. I don't know if that's coming or not. I don't know if he does interviews, but I'll have to ask him. But yeah, I would be very curious to know if he late swapped here, just based on how his lineup was looking. And then like, kind of like, hey, do you remember what those pieces were? And we could see like kind of what he got to here. So that was my only thoughts really on his lineup.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing is, and we see this time after time is, I mean, Brock Purdy has 22% ownership, which is high, but these quarterbacks usually just don't get that high ownership. So, if your favorite QB is who you expect to be the highest owned QB, I think that's a lot better than trying to get cute going with, someone like Sam Howell or Russell Wilson trying to get more contrarian, because maybe Brock Purdy is just straight up way better, and that ownership difference just is not that much. So I think that's sort of interesting too.
So one thing that's really sticking out to me here is that, we see that we've been talking all season about how the sim has been liking these lower salary quarterbacks. And we think that they've been good plays throughout the year here. Max, have people been watching our show, man? Like, are people catching on to this? Because I'm looking here like at, highest projected down, higher salary quarterbacks. Like, people just really aren't getting to like Jalen Hurts, a lot of lower ownership on CJ Stroud, another 8K quarterback, Justin Herbert, like basically nobody playing it, but everybody's kind of going after these lower salary quarterbacks. And that's exactly what we've been seeing all season here.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I'd see, because I don't know if it's as much a lower salary as it's lower ownership. So my guess is the sim is actually going to like Jalen Hurts, and might even like Justin Herbert at fractional ownership. I'd be curious. I think it's just sort of like, it's just the slate. All the high price stacks were just really priced up. Like Jalen Hurts was priced up, AJ Brown was priced up, Devonta Smith. So I think basically people go where the value is, and just Sam Howell and Russell Wilson were where some of that value was. And Sam Howell in particular allowed you to kind of get some correlation with Tyreek Hill, who is very popular.
Right.
So I think that was sort of more of the explanation there. I'd be curious, do you want to order these lineups by sim ROI? Because one thing
absolutely
curious about is, what were the Sabres' favorite quarterbacks of the slate? And then also, how much is Zach Moss in these top lineups? Because obviously he was 85% owned. And the question is that fine?
Seeing
and I think
Russell Wilson, Minshew.
Right. Well, so that's interesting. So he is appearing in Minshew lineups. It seems like Saber likes him in Minshew lineups, but he really is sort of just in the top lineups. And I think, the reason he's 85% owned is he projects really, really well. And basically he's going to play every snap, and his downside game is basically like 8 to 10 fantasy points. And it's a 10-game slate. So, I think people looked at this and thought, oh my God, this is ridiculous. But again, Shady won with Zach Moss for one thing. And the other thing is, like, what are the other pivots? How much are they going to outperform? One way I tried to tackle this issue was I ended up stacking Derrick Henry with the Titans D, like we saw a few weeks ago, where Devin Singletary with Houston
right
would play. But it seems like the top lineups don't seem to like that. So that's sort of interesting to me. I think when the opposing offense is like a bunch of stacks that are going to be chalky, maybe that's better than when it's just going to be one player who's a running back.
Yeah, I mean, I actually thought Zach Moss wasn't in one of these lineups, but he's in all 12. So like all top 12 lineups all have Zach Moss here.
Yeah. And that also I think my guess is with 85% ownership, you could kind of go either way. I think probably what's going on is the good players who are making the best lineups are using Zach Moss, so there's bias there. My guess is I find it hard to believe that like he was unequivocally a good play. And obviously he can be a piece of a good lineup, but I bet there's a particular lineup structure that. But why don't we just look at my lineup? Do you want to look me up and see what the ROI of that was? Because I just had one entry. And
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious. Is there any particular reason David Njoku was just like slammed at about 20% ownership here? And I mean, kind of put
he's
up
really
a ton.
good and he's cheap. I mean, he projected well. I got him in some lineups. I think the thing is also it's like a 10-game slate. So there's not that many choices at tight end. I think tight end was pretty thin this week. So let's see. Oh, I had a negative ROI. Interesting. I would have thought that would have been better, but I think that's a lesson actually, because I think that obviously the Titans D did not project that well. And maybe given that there's only sort of one piece of the Colts offense that's getting really high owned, that doesn't actually help that much. And where you're going to get the real leverage on a defense is when the quarterback does really badly, throwing interceptions, getting sacked, and that's where that defense gives you leverage. So I think I actually made a mistake here and should have just went with a better defense instead of just stacking Henry and the Titans.
I think the example that you're talking about was when we saw the Cardinals and the Texans, right?
Yeah,
and the Texans were like super high owned, very, very popular.
And the Cardinals were too.
Yeah, and then SaberSim like that Cardinals defense play in direct opposition. So I definitely see where you're coming from, but then it does make sense. It's like, well, the Colts, aside from Zach Moss, weren't really in that situation, in that like same kind of tier. I was gonna say maybe if you combine the Zach Moss ownership, it ends up being the same or even higher, but just the way it works out.
No, I think but I think that's a good point. Is Singletary in that instance, in that Arizona Houston? I forget what week it is. I hope people are remembering this, but basically that kind of, if Singletary in the Houston defense does well, that destroys an entire game stack, which is really valuable. Where it destroys it, and it might not even destroy the play, right? It's like Zach Moss can do well when Derrick Henry does well, and he could also actually have a fine game with the Titans D as well. But like an entire game stack could not possibly do well if the Titans D, or if the Houston D did well in that example, or the core, and so I think that's where that sort of play is a lot better. So that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to hop over to the large field?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So I got it pulled up here already sorted by sim ROI. And I do want to see the ownership differences here a little bit. So Zach Moss still super high owned, as expected here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Well, what was Tyreek Hill's ownership in the larger field one? Was it lower or higher?
Let's go look.
Let's see. It was
54.
Higher. Wow. I mean, Washington's defense is so bad. I think something that's interesting that I'm seeing here is when you're thinking about ownership, I think you always have to think about game stacks and how people are going to play these game stacks. Because if you look at Tyreek Hill, right, he got really high ownership. And I'm not surprised, right? It's like, everyone knows that, the Washington's defense is horrible against receivers, and Tyreek Hill has just been so good. But what that means is Washington players are probably going to get higher ownership than you think, right? Curtis Samuel, 24% ownership. That really, really surprises me. Sam Howell, we saw, was the second highest owned QB. And I think when you have something like that, that's where you can actually make some good money, kind of pivoting away from that type of play. These like secondary plays where their ownership is just getting boosted because of correlation, but they actually don't project that well. So I think sort of my lesson of this week was, Curtis Samuel and Sam Howell were probably pretty bad plays. I'm sure they're part of some higher ROI lineups, but I think they ended up being kind of bad plays. And you can see that they're not really in these top lineups.
Right. The only one we're seeing is Logan Thomas. I
Right.
don't see any Samuel or Hal. So I
Yeah.
think that your analysis there is spot on. And then even, Scary Terry making an appearance here. So
I think
very
what's
interesting.
interesting at the top of this one is Will Levis.
Right.
It's kind of interesting because, well, I mean, he just really got fractional ownership. But I mean, even having like Traylon Burks in this lineup, it's like a really high ROI lineup.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting to me. I think that basically, if you can actually have a viable quarterback in this contest that legitimately gets 1% ownership, that play ends up just being really, really good, apparently. So, because, and Will Levis has upside, right? He threw for 4 touchdowns 1 week. And that's not totally a fluke because his ADOT is super high. He definitely has upside. And that's interesting to me that he appears in so many of these top lineups in the big field.
Yeah, I think one thing that I was just checking, scrolling back and forth here, is that this lineup really didn't sacrifice that many projected points. Like out of the top 10 lineups, the top projected was like 137. And this one's coming in at 132 here, even with, a projected for 6 points, Traylon Burks, Will Levis, like not the best value here, but they still like found those other pieces. They have this big game stack with the QB +2 and 2 bringbacks here. So they're getting the correlation, but they're not sacrificing too many projected points, which I think is kind of the key here based on what we've seen in the past, like with the Brock Purdy situation, that was obviously very controversial with your Twitter thread that you posted.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so like in that scenario, somebody was sacrificing, 10-ish projected points here to go with like Purdy and his players. But then here, you're seeing like, hey, they're getting the correlation, but they're not sacrificing as much projected points, and then it's still grading out very well. So just some things I'm catching on here.
I think another thing too is, and I haven't seen this before, and I guess we've only looked at a few weeks of these millionaire makers, but I'm seeing Marvin Mims in a lineup and I'm seeing Traylon Burks in a lineup. And I think what is going on here is just when you get to low enough ownership in these contests, 0.3%, if we look at it as a ratio, is over 200 to 1, right? So if 1 out of 100 times Traylon Burks has a good game with the Levis high upside game, he becomes like just a real smash play that's going to help you out quite a bit in winning this tournament. Same with Marvin Mims, right? And we know both these players have upside. So I think that's really, really interesting is that with these stacks, right? If you just can get some real low ownership, and we're going to see this in later weeks as these are 12 game, 13 game slates. This is going to be a possibility. So I think that's something where taking a little more risk in your stacks and, trying to just get some of these, thinking about who are the actual viable QBs that are the real in the dumps going to get less than 3% ownership, and trying to get some of those guys in your lineups because it seems like they have a really great EV.
This isn't like a direct correlation to what you're saying. I'm not trying to like mislead anybody or like make connections that aren't perfectly there, but that line of thinking of these fractional owned wide receivers, you kind of touched on that in your TakeCast interview with Davis Maddock, where you were kind of talking about like best ball strategy, and you were saying like, hey, everyone's kind of going for like the 0 RB build, but like I kind of think best ball strategy like is go for, kind of the best, like you basically made a comparison. Like, do you think lower owned, low salary wide receivers are going to do better more often, or lower owned like running backs? And you're kind of making the argument that like you think over the course of a season these wide receiver 3s, these wide receiver 4s have more ability to kind of go off on any week than like the running backs do.
No, we see it over and over again. It's, it's not that much of a stretch that one of Traylon Burks or Marvin Mims occasionally has a really good game. I'm trying to think if this actually happened this week, but I would say basically every week there's some random wide receiver who has some talent, who has like a 15-point fantasy game, who just is not very high up. So again, I'm not saying just like throw money away, just like randomly playing this receiver, but it does seem like if it's part of a stack and, you can get a stack where like the total ownership of the stack is really, really small. The Sims really like it. So it's something that I'm going to try to incorporate into my process as we get into these later weeks for sure.
Yeah. I think that kind of point right there, like the early season to kind of late season strategy switch is very interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, do you think teams play different as like we get into the end of the year? Like, do you think teams are already starting to think about next year and get more playing time for like younger guys? How do you think all that kind of works out, making the switch? Like, we're already in week 13, so we're getting pretty close here.
I have found that there actually is not that much of a difference, even actually in like what used to be week 17 is now week 18. You actually will find teams that are completely out of it will just play it like a normal game. So I actually feel like things don't change that much. I'm just more talking about, we've seen a lot of 10 game slates, and with 10 game slates, that's not a lot of games, especially with how many QBs have been injured. Like the over under of like half these games is under 40. When we get later in the season, we're going to get 12, 13, 14 game slates. And when we get that, that's when ownerships are going to be a little more spread out. You're going to be able to find more kind of less than 3% owned type plays and stacks like that. And that's something where you definitely want to try to go hunting for some of those viable ones.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Max, man, is there anything else you wanted to cover today?
I think we're good. I think this was a good video. Again, congratulations to Shady Advice. Super nice guy. SaberSim user, always happy. I think he'll probably be getting a Rolex by the end of the year, which is really fun. And just to actually explain what I'm talking about, if you do win $1 million with the SaberSim logo, we buy you a Rolex. I got one last year. So
yeah, I don't think you've showed it off. You're gonna have to bring it to next week's show.
Let me show it off right now. Hold on. Let's pause the video.
Go grab it.
Yeah. All righty. So,
all right.
Okay. So,
okay. Go ahead.
How do I even show this all? So this is my Rolex. It's SaberSim green. It's a Datejust, and I love it. And I got this last year for winning that Millionaire maker. So
yeah. So for those of you who don't know what Max is talking about, he's talking about our Winner's Circle promotion. So it's a free promotion that you can get in on. It's up here when you go to SaberSim.com. Go to Winner's Circle. And if you win $1 million, you get free SaberSim for life. You get your custom engraved Rolex, which Max is showing off right now. You get all of the other prizes for all of the other tiers of the Winner's Circle here. And then you get put on this front page here. So we got Max with his 2022, 2023 showdown win. We have Giant Squid here with a NFL 18-19 win. And then Shady Advice coming very soon to this leaderboard here. So that is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, there's an argument about which Sims are the best, but we're the only Sim that gives you a Rolex if you win big. So I think the argument is over.
All right, everybody. Thank you guys for tuning in. As always, here, we'll be right back next week for our week 14 show. Max, thank you for your time and insight as always. So until next week, guys, take care.
See ya.